Hello, and welcome to Four Dudes Talking About U.S. History, the final season. This season will have 3 episodes, and this first episode is about Roosevelt and the New Deal. So, Roosevelt. There's 2 different Roosevelts that were also our presidents. We got Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. This first lesson will be about Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, for sake of time, we'll call him FDR. He had quite the interesting life. When he was young, he learned to hunt, ride horses, sail, all that kind of stuff. He was a nature's man. He went to college at Harvard, and he met Eleanor Roosevelt, the niece of Theodore Roosevelt, a previous president, whom he later married. After he graduated from Harvard, he went to Columbia Law School. Now, FDR, he liked to be in control. He liked to have control over things. He liked to know what was going on. He had a good personality. He had a nice voice, and his smile was expressed as confident and optimistic. All this being, he ended up being a very good person for politics and things like that. So much, in fact, he started his political career in 1910 when he was elected to the New York State Senate, that's a big deal because New York is a popular state. 3 years later, he became the Assistant Secretary of the Navy in the Wilson administration.
So, was there any negatives in his life?
Oh, absolutely. A very big negative that happened in FDR's life was he got this very paralytic disease called polio. And so basically, it took over his body, and it made it super hard for him to move. But FDR, being the man he is, he wasn't going to go down without a fight. So what he did is he started a super vigorous exercise program to restore the muscles back in his arms and legs so that he could move again. And so what he did is he could walk around with a cane and leaning on somebody's shoulder, but it obviously was difficult because he had metal braces tied to his legs, so he had to swing his legs on his hips and stuff. But anyways, while recovering from polio, he depended on different people. His wife and Louis Howe. His aide, sorry. To keep his name prominent in the New York Democratic Party, his wife, Eleanor, became a very important public speaker to keep him relevant. And so in the mid-1920s, Roosevelt won the election for governor in New York. Now, he campaigned super hard to show that his illness and stuff didn't just take him out completely. He was still a relevant person. And with all that and stuff, he just barely won the election. In fact, Roosevelt's popularity in the New York government made it super easy for him to win the presidential election in 1932. The Americans saw his confidence and things like that, and they thought he would just be a great president, and he was. And after he became president, he was super confident and all this stuff like that. And one of his aides commented on it, and he said, "If you had spent 2 years in bed trying to wiggle your big toe, after that, anything else would seem easy." In mid-June 1932, when the country was in the Great Depression, Republicans gathered in Chicago, and what they did is they said, "Hey, we want Herbert Hoover to run the second term as president, not FDR." And so later that month, the Democrats also went to Chicago, and they said, "We want FDR to keep doing this." And Franklin D. Roosevelt, he won by a landslide. And to break the tradition of just accepting it, he flew to Chicago to accept it in person. And when he got there, this speech set the tone for his campaign.
"Let it be from now on the task of our party to break foolish traditions. It is inevitable that the main issue of this campaign should revolve about a depression so deep that it is without precedent. Republican leaders not only have failed in material things, they have failed in national vision because in disaster they have held out no hope. I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people."
And after that, Roosevelt's way for ending the Depression was known as the New Deal. Roosevelt's confidence to get the Americans out of the Great Depression, made him such a great president, and made Herbert Hoover look horrible because he was horrible.
Cheeks.
And on the election day to become president again, Roosevelt won without a doubt. It wasn't even close.
Didn't only 6 states vote for Hoover?
Mm-hmm. He won every single vote except for in 6 states.
Well, Malachi, that was pretty neat. After Roosevelt won the presidency in November of 1932, the situation in the country just began to go down. Unemployment continued to rise and bank runs increased. The American citizens feared that Roosevelt would lower the gold standard. And the gold standard is like how much money gold is worth. You know, it's kind of like in our country today, where like gold is worth a certain amount. You know, goes up with inflation. You know, kind of stays the same.
Yeah.
But a lot of Americans and even foreign investors with deposits in American banks decided to take their money and convert it to gold before it lost all its value. And across the nation, people stood in lines with paper bags and suitcases waiting to take their money out of these banks. And by March 1933, more than 4,000 banks had collapsed, wiping out 9 million bank accounts.
Yeesh.
In 38 states, all these governors, they declared a thing called bank holidays, which they just closed the remaining banks, so people didn't try to take their money out and make the banks go out of business. And by the day of Roosevelt's inauguration, most of the nation banks were closed, and 1 in 4 workers were unemployed. And Roosevelt knew he had to restore the nation's confidence. And he in his inaugural address, he stated, "Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. The nation asked for action, and action now."
So this led to the New Deal, as we all know. So Roosevelt, he had ideas how he could end the Depression, because it was pretty bad. But he really had no clear agenda, and he didn't have, any strong ideology for it. But he did argue that the country needed a bold, persistent experiment, we'll go with, above all, just to try to see what they could do. So he sent the bill after bill and kept sending bills to Congress. But on March 9th to June 16th, 1933, which was called the 100 Days, which you guys probably heard of, Congress did pass the 15 major acts to resolve the crisis. And these programs made up what will now be called the First Deal.
Wow. Yeah. Well, Roosevelt, we all know, the president, he was the man who had the final decision on the policies in the New Deal. But he really kind of depended on his advisors for new ideas, and he chose different advisors with different views because he wanted to hear every single view from a different viewpoint. And he had 3 main groups of advisors. One group of advisors supported the belief that the government should work with businesses to regulate wages, prices, and production, and lift the economy out of the depression. And that's how they thought they'd get out of it. And the second group of advisors distrusted big businesses and felt big business leaders had caused the depression and wanted government planners to run key parts of the economy, which kind of went against the Constitution. And the third group of advisors supported former President Woodrow Wilson's New Freedom philosophy because they wanted Roosevelt to break up big companies and allow competition to set wages, prices, and production levels. This group of advisors also thought that the government should impose regulations to keep economic competition fair.
In other terms, as we've talked about before, farmers were struggling and suffering very much because, there was too low of production and the costs were too high, and the nation's farmers were really struggling. So they really needed something to help, right? So Congress passed the Agriculture Adjustment Act, also stood for the AAA. So basically what this was, it was an act based on a simple idea that, prices for farm goods were very low, right? But the reason because that is because they grew too much food. So under this act, the government, Agriculture Adjustment Administration, basically what they do is they pay for farmers to not to raise the price of certain livestock and to grow certain crops and produce dairy products. So over the next 2 years, Farmers had millions of more acres and cultivation, and get this, more than $1 billion in support funds. So that helped out a lot, especially with the depression and all that. And get this though, not all farmers benefited. Thousands still struggled, especially African American farmers. They lost their jobs, and greedy landlords took away everything they wanted and stuff, and it was rough. But the National Industrial Recovery Act, NIRA, passed a law that authorized to suspend antitrust laws and allowed business, labor, and government to cooperate with the rules. And in Tennessee, the Tennessee Valley Authority, it was a new deal, right? But it produced great results. The TVA also built dams, controlled floods, conserved forest lands, and bring electricity to rural areas. So this was Teddy Roosevelt's idea, kind of keeping the land good and stuff, which leads us into... So speaking of that, there was banks and debt relief at this time. So Roosevelt knew that there was very few programs that would help the nation's banks because they were all closed at this time. But before he could do anything else, he had to make people believe in the banking system again because everyone was kind of against it at this time. So what he did is there was the Emergency Banking Relief Act, and it got passed. And this law required federal examiners to survey the nation's banks and issue Treasury Department licenses to those that were, had enough money. So on March 12th, he addressed the nation by radio. Over 60 million people listened to this first of many fireside chats, which is a radio broadcast which was made by Roosevelt to the American people to explain his initiatives. And in this, he said, quote unquote, I assure you that it is safer to keep your money in a reopened bank than under the mattress. So that made many people want to put their money into the banks because you got to trust the president, right? That's a joke. But anyways, so many people had confidence in the banking system. It was kind of restored around the nation. So Roosevelt proceeded to use powers granted in the Emergency Banking Relief Act to take the dollar away from the gold standard because back then everyone was still with gold and stuff. So no one could demand gold in payment for things anymore. It was mainly like cash and dollars and stuff. So almost immediately after that, inflation through the roof. And this is exactly what he wanted. So the purpose of going away from the gold standard was to cause inflation. But Roosevelt didn't like that term. He called it reflation because he thought that the dollar was overvalued from decades of deflation. So he wanted to cause inflation to help people in debt. But when money inflates, it loses value. So debts become way easier to pay because the money owed is not worth as much. But inflation caused the prices to go up, which Roosevelt hoped. But the increase in prices earned more money for farmers, which is good. And they were really suffering at this time, so it was really good for them for that. And they stayed away from the gold standard for about 9 months until the president thought the dollar's value had fallen way too far. So in 1934, he set up a new price for the gold standard. 1 ounce of gold, only $35.
Going along with that, a lot of Roosevelt's advisors and things like that wanted to come up with new regulations and stuff to help with the banks and stuff. So Roosevelt agreed with this, and they came up with the Securities Act of 1933 and the Banking Act of 1933. And these together were commonly known as the Glass-Steagall Act. And so basically, what the Securities Act did is it made sure that banks told investors, they gave them good information so that they knew what to invest in and stuff like that. And this eventually, it turned into the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission. And the other side of the Glass-Steagall Act was the FDIC, which is what it became, which was the Banking Act. So the FDIC, it guarantees that bank deposits up to $250,000 by all member banks will be funded and insured by premiums paid by the banks, not by the taxpayer money. And so all this stuff is brand new. At first, none of it wanted to when the stock markets and stuff were first created, nobody seriously considered government regulation over this stuff because of laissez-faire stuff. But after all this crashed in 1929, the opinions on that completely changed, and they wanted this to happen. And as a matter of fact, the FDIC, it still exists today. And as I said, the FDIC and the SEC, they're not the same. The FDIC is insuring investors' monies up to $250,000. The SEC has nothing to do with insurance or nothing like that. The SEC is just giving investors good information so that they know what to invest into.
Another important thing that Roosevelt did during his term was helped a lot of farmers not lose their homes and land. So he helped create the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and they just bought mortgages of homeowners who were behind on their payments. And of course, the homeowners had to pay back these loans or the mortgages, but they did it at a lower interest rate, so it was easier to do. And then he also helped create the Farm Credit Administration, which helped the farmers refinance their mortgages. And these loans that helped these farmers just saved millions of farms from foreclosure. And I mean, although the FCA kind of slowed the economic recovery by making less money available to lend to the efficient businesses, it helped desperate and impoverished people. And this was like the first time in history that the government was involved with helping people pay their mortgages.
And another thing that kind of piggybacks off that was relief programs. Many of President Roosevelt's advisors, which he had many advisors for different points of views, thought that changing the prices would change. Sorry, not change. And providing debt relief would solve the depression. While the other advisors of his, thought that the fundamental cause was low consumption. But all of them agreed that getting money into the hands of the needy individuals would be the fastest way to fix the depression. But because neither Roosevelt nor his advisors wanted to give money to the unemployed, they turned to work programs instead, which, like Kane was talking about, this was also the first time that the government had made and paid for work programs. Before the Depression, if they did this, which was very rare, it would always be the state and local governments would pay for it. But now the federal government is going to pay for it, and the state is going to set it up. But this would go even further in the New Deal when they created many federal jobs that pushed the country out of the Great Depression.
And one of the most highly praised relief programs from the New Deal was the Civilian Conservation Corps. And so basically what this was, the Triple C or the CCC, it offered a bunch of unemployed 18 to 25-year-old men, and what they would do is they would go out and they'd work for the Forestry Service planting trees. They'd plant trees, fight forest fires, build reservoirs, things like that. So what they did is they planted 200 million trees from North Texas all the way up to, shout out, North Dakota.
PU.
Okay.
Anyways, these young men, they lived in camps near where they were working at, and they earned $30 a month, and $25 of that went straight back home to their families. So they made about $5 a month for them. And after all this was over, when it ended in 1942, there was about 3 million people that would have been in this thing, including 80,000 Native Americans and 250,000 veterans from the, the bonus army, the bonus marches and things like that.
So a few weeks after the CCC was authorized, Congress established the FERA, which stands for Federal Emergency Relief Administration. So Roosevelt chose a man with the name of Harry Hopkins, and back in the day, he was a social worker, and he ran the FERA. Initially, though, it did not create many projects for the unemployed. Instead, what it did is it kind of gave money to the state and local governments to fund these new relief projects. So after he met with Roosevelt, they had some discussions and stuff. He spent $5 million on relief projects. But critics charged that some of the projects did not make sense in the long run. But Hopkins replied, in his words, "People don't eat in the long run. They eat every day." And that's facts. So in June 1933, Congress authorized another relief agency, which was the PWA, which stands for Public Works Administration. So 1/3 of the nation's unemployed were in the construction industry. So this really helped them out and stuff. So that put them back into work, and the PWA saw good signs of this, so they began building highways, dams, schools, and other government facilities to provide more jobs for these people. And they awarded contracts to construction companies. So by that, they insisted that contractors don't discriminate against African Americans and other, races and stuff. So the agency broke down the racial barriers, and that's why these days you still see many Mexicans, African Americans doing construction.
Well, during this time, I mean, there were still a lot of jobs being, out. But in fall of 1933, neither the FERA nor the PWA had reduced unemployment significantly. And Hopkins realized that unless the federal government acted quickly, a huge number of unemployed citizens would be in severe distress once winter comes. So pretty much he just he had President Roosevelt authorize him to set up the Civil Works Administration, which was pretty much just the federal government hiring workers. They employed something like 4 million people, and including 300,000 women, and the agency pretty much just improved things like 1,000 airports, 500,000 miles of road, 40,000 school buildings, 3,500 playgrounds and parks. But the program nearly spent $1 billion. So President Roosevelt was kind of getting worried about it. So he urged the agency to shut down by spring.
So I got a quote from this too that he said, "Long after the workers of CWA are dead and gone, and these hard times are forgotten, their effort will be remembered by permanent useful works in every county of every state." So I think we talked about a lot of good things today. So I think it's time to wrap it up. It's been real.
It's been fun.
But it hasn't been real fun.